Masechet Rosh Hashana Daf Yud Bet. Three main topics. We're going to start off with some astronomy, and that's going to relate to the time when the world was created. And then we're going to move on to the next item in our very first Mishnah, all the way on Daf Bet. The next item was Ma'aseh, specifically of vegetables, but also other related things. And then we'll talk a little bit about vows. So we said yesterday there's a famous machloket between the Rabbi Eliezer, who says the world was created in Tishrei, and Rabbi Yoshua, who says the world was created in Nisan. And the Gemara starts off now showing that their opinion here accords with what they say somewhere else regarding the timing of the flood. V'azdu l'tamayu detanya bishnat 600 shana lechaye Noach b'chodesh hasheni b'shiva'asar yom lachodesh. The flood began in the 600th year, counting from Noach's life, in the second month. But second month is not clear. A second month of what? Counting from when? And so if it was Nisan, then that would be Iyar. And so each of the Tanaim are going to interpret this Chodesh Hasheni according to them. Rabbi Yoshua will say it's Iyar, and Rabbi Eliezer will say it's Mar Cheshvan. So let's see how this works. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, Oto hayom 17 be'iyar haya, yom shemazal kima shokea bayom u'ma'yanot mitma'atin, umitoch sheshinu ma'asehen, shina kadosh baruch hu alehem ma'aseh bereshit, ve'ela mazal kima bayom, ve'natal shene kochabim mikima, ve'vi mabul la'olam. So first of all, the Gemara is assuming that the dates of Noach, that Noach counted his years, start at the same time as whenever creation. So if creation started in Nisan, it was Rabbi Yoshua says, then so too the years of Noach are also going to start from Nisan. Why does it make that assumption? Is not really clear, but let's go with that. So Rabbi Yoshua says that it was this was the second month of the year, which is Iyar, and that's when the constellation called Kima, Pleiades, also known as in Greek, goes down during the day, and also during that time in the spring, the water is low because in the springtime, that's it. The rainfall is low, and so the springs have diminished. So there's not much water, and Kima is associated with water, and that's also going down. So it's weak. Kima is weak, the constellation that controls water is weak, and the spring is weak. And so it's not really a good time for a flood. You wouldn't expect it then. However, because the human beings changed their acts of from creation, in other words, they were acting badly, not the way they were supposed to, not the way they were commanded. So too, Hashem changed nature for them. There's an interesting correlation here between moral order and natural order. And when human beings cause chaos in their society, so too nature responds, causing chaos. And that's a very nice parallel there. And so what did Hashem do? What's the mechanism by which he brought the flood? Well, he made this constellation of Kima, instead of going down, come up. In other words, get stronger. And he took two stars away from it. So Pleiades looks kind of like this. It's also known as the Seven Sisters in Greek mythology, also known as the Water Girls. So they are associated with water. And so these stars seem to control water, regulate it. And by taking two out, perhaps that means he kind of unplugged these two holes, and then lots of water came forth. And that brought V'hebi mabul la'olam. Okay, so that would be Rabbi Yoshua. And since he says the world was created in Nisan, so too the flood started in the second month after Nisan. Now, Rabbi Eliezer has a slightly different version. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Oto hayom 17 b'mar cheshvan haya. He says it was, in fact, the 600th year, but the second month counting from Tishrei. And then that time, the constellations are different. Yom shemazal kima oleh bayom. In this, during this time, the constellation is rising. U'ma'yanot mitgaberim. And also during that time of the year, the springs are increasing. And so this is already a time when the water is, and the constellation that controls water is very active. And these are the same words, because the people changed their actions to wrong actions, so too Hashem then caused chaos in nature. Now this is confusing because we said that during this time, Kima is already up during the day. So what does it mean that he brought it up? Brought it up further? The Gemara will ask this question. And you took 2 stars away from it, maybe opening it up, and that caused a flood. So good. So that's the 2 versions. And so each one follows their own opinion. Okay, a little bit of background, what this astrology, we're not going to explain all the astrology, but at least 2 relevant parallel sources. The Gemara does not quote this pasuk in Amos, but I think for sure it's behind the scenes why they chose this in the first place. The pasuk in Amos says, "Oseh kima uchsil ve'ofech laboker salmavet," showing the Hashem's great power in the universe, and says, "Who made Pleiades and Orion?" Hashem did. And who turns darkness into dawn and darkens day into night? V'yom laila hechshich koreh lemei hayam v'yishpechem al pnei haaretz Adonai shemo, who summons waters of the sea and pours them out on the earth. So this is describing, well, it could describe a big rain, but it sounds like it's describing a huge rain, a flood, and that's associated with the constellation of Pleiades. So that's one item that's behind this. And then a parallel source to our Gemara is found back in Berachot, where it says Kima. It explains the name of it. Shemuel says Keme'a kochve. Kima is a concatenation of it's 100 stars. In fact, it's 7 that are prominent, but there's a whole cluster around them. And I'm sure if you look with a modern telescope, you'll find even more stars right there. And when Hashem wanted to make the Mabul, he took 2 kochavim, 2 stars away from the constellation of Pleiades, and brought it. And when he wanted to stop it up, then he took 2 kochavim from another constellation and stopped it up. He couldn't use the same one and just put them back, because in kategor naaseh sanegor, you can't use the same constellation to attack as the one to defend. So that's this is a parallel source. So I explained it as kind of pulling the plug out from a stopper and then the rain coming out. Another way to think of it is that it seems that Pleiades was actually a calming effect. This was associated with sailing and calming the waters, actually controlling the waters. So taking 2 stars out would be weakening this constellation. And so if you weaken the constellation that controls the waters, then the waters will become uncontrollable, too active, and overpower. So that's just another way to think about it. All right, so now we understand how the mechanism by which the flood came through these constellations, and how they're associated with the different times of the year when the constellation is on the rise or on the decline, whether it's seen during the day or it's seen at night. Okay, Bishlama the Rabbi Yoshua Hanu Dichtib Sheni. So now we understand, according to the Rabbi Yoshua, why it says the 2nd month, because Rabbi Yoshua says it's from Nisan, and Nisan is always the 1st month, and Sheni is going to be Iyad. That's standard. Whenever the Torah says the 2nd month, it's talking about Iyad. Ela Rabbi Eliezer, my Sheni. According to Rabbi Eliezer, why does it say the 2nd month? No one ever counts months from Tishrei. Okay, no, but everyone agrees that's from Nisan. So then what would be the 2nd month? You're not starting from Tishrei. And the answer is Sheni Ladin, the 2nd month of judgment. We're starting the calendar of when Hashem just judged the world, and then so counting from there. So that could be, it's its own beginning calendar. Now, Bishlama Rabbi Yoshua Hainu Deshina. We understand again, according to Rabbi Yoshua, why it says that Hashem changed nature, because beforehand the waters were calm and Pleiades was down, and so Hashem had to change it to make Pleiades up and to make the water rage. So that's a change. El Yoshua Maishina, according to Eliezer, there was no change. Pleiades is already going up in the morning. And so it's already strong, and the waters are already strong. So the answer is Kidrab Chistat. Berotchin kilkilu, berotchin nidonu. Not see that the change was not that there is a flood. There was that flood was natural. What was special about the Mabul, what was different about it, is that the waters were boiling. That in the flood, Hashem brought all the water to heat. And so not only were they drowned, but they were also boiled. And so what does it mean, this midah keneged midah? Bedotchin kilkilu ba'avera, that they sinned with illegal sexual relations, which is called boiling. It's hot. And therefore, as midah keneged midah, they were punished also with hot water. And the proof for this is at the end of the Mabul, it says that the waters calm down. And they use the word vayashoku. But that same root is found with the king Achashverosh. Says his anger, shachacha, calm down. Now, usually anger is associated with heat and means, then even in English, you say he cooled down. So just like his anger cooled down, so to here, after the flood, the water cooled down. That means during the flood, it was hot. And that's how we close off our understanding of the flood, its timing, and some of its details. And the last thing about this is how we count nowadays. The sages of Israel, when they want to calculate the chronology of things that happen, so Mabul, they assume that Rabbi Eliezer is correct. And so in fact, just like the flood started in Mad Cheshvan, that would mean they agree that generally the creation happened in Tishrei. However, La Tkufa Rabbi Yoshua, when they're calculating other matters, halachot that relate to Birkat HaChama, when we bless the sun, we do that every 28 years. And so that we have to count from Nisan, and also to calculate the molad of the moon, we calculate from the sun. So we take we accept both for different purposes. However, Chachmei Umot HaOlam, the sages of other nations, Monim Afal Mabul Rabbi Yoshua, they follow Nisan for everything. Okay, now it's not clear who they're talking about. Who are these sages of the other nations? Apparently, they know something about the flood. They're Bible reading, so maybe it's talking about Christians or some group that followed Nisan. All right, good. So that concludes the discussion on astronomy, and now we go on with the next item in our Mishnah, which is Rosh Hashana of Tishrei. The first of Tishrei is a head of year for vegetables, ve'lirakot. Good. So, which means that any vegetables that are cut before Rosh Hashanah will be part of the previous fiscal year, and then after Rosh Hashanah will be the next fiscal year. You cannot take maaser from one year to for the other. So something you pick next year, it has to be maaser for that year. That's the Mishnah. Now we're going to quote a Braita, and we're going to spend a lot of time. The Braita is only 3 words long, but we're going to analyze each one of the words. So Tana, lirakot, ul ma'asrot, ve'lindarim. So 3 things that are also added on here for Tishrei. Yirakot, that's the same as the Mishnah, but also adds tithing and vows. Now we have to explain this. Lirakot maininhu ma'asar yarak. When it says yirakot, what does it mean that for vegetables? What about vegetables? For the tithing of vegetables. Good. Well, then haynu ma'asrot, and that's the same thing. This baraita seems to be redundant. Lirakot and ma'asrot, right? This tithing of vegetables and tithing. So what is it talking about? The answer is Tana de Rabbanan v'katane de Oraita. It's talking about 2 different types of tithing. One is the Rabbanan. So here's something important to know. We're going to learn a lot about tithing today, that the maaser for vegetables is only midrabanan. Midoraita, you have to bring a maaser for grain and olives and grapes. Grain, olives, and grapes that are going to be used for wine and oil. That's it. Fruit is a separate matter. Fruit is a machloket between Rashi, who says Rabbanan, Rambam says Estoraita. But fruit, in any case, that the fiscal year for fruit is Tu Bishvat. So we don't have to deal with fruit, although grapes are fruit, but they're their own category. Okay, so now we see that Yirakot here, the first item in the list, is referring to vegetables, which are midrabanan, and maaserot is talking about grain and wine and oil that require maaser midoraita. That's why it has 2 categories. So we wonder about this. Which was more important? Wasn't deoraita more important? Shouldn't deoraita take precedence? So you should say maaserot and then yirakot. The answer is Aide de Habibale Aktema, because the Rabbanan laws are more beloved. This comes in other Gemarot and Midrashim that say that the Torah law is absolute, necessary. But when we want to show our great love for Hashem and for the Torah, we do that through the Rabbanan, because this is over and above what is absolutely required. And so therefore, the laws of the Rabbanan are even more beloved to the rabbis, or to us, to Hashem. And so therefore, in fact, it's better to start off with even Yedakot, which is great. Okay, now Betana Didan, that's good for the Baraita. But what about our Mishnah? Our Mishnah only mentioned one category of Yedakot. That's it. What about Maaser for grain? Doesn't say anything about it. The Mishnah always wants to be concise, right? Biuda Nazi knew that we're going to have to memorize this whole thing. So if you could save a word, then he saves a word and you can derive it. If Yedakot, which are only the Banan, you have to bring, and Tishrei as the time, then all the more so you know that for sure you have to bring Maaser for Doraita, things like grain, and that would be the same time. Now, Velitni Maaser. Next question is, how come it says Maaserot? Because after all, it's not talking about maaser for grain and for vegetables. Vegetables is already included in its own category. So what's with the plural? Tithes. Echad maasar behema, echad maasar dagan. The answer is that it includes both tithes of animals and tithes of grain. So you see tithes of animals. We already saw that this is machloket. Some say it's Rosh Chodesh Elul, but this baraita is going according to those who say it's Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. Velitne Yadak, and now Yadakot in this Baraita is also plural, and the Mishnah is plural. Why? Why don't you say one Yadak? Today, Gavne Yadak, well, there's two categories of vegetables too. Ditnan Yadak Ne'egad, Mishe Yaged, Visheno Ne'egad, Mishe Yimale Tekeli. At what point do vegetables, when you first pick vegetables, you're allowed to eat from them temporary if you're just snacking. At what point do you stop that and you have to take the maaser before you can eat any more? Well, when they're completed their processing. So what do you call completed their processing? For vegetables that you usually bundle together, it's from when you bundle them together. That's one category. And for vegetables that you don't normally bundle together, then it's when you put them into a basket. It's when you fill up the basket. Then they are finished processing, and then you can't have a temporary snack of them anymore. Then you're going to have to take the maaser. So that explains the plural language. Okay, good. Now another braita about this. Teno banan liket yadak erev Rosh Hashana ad shelo tavo hashemesh. You go and you pull some carrots out of the ground before Rosh Hashana, before sunset, and then v'chazar v'liket mishet tavo hashemesh, and you took a few more afterwards. Not that you're allowed to pick vegetables, but okay, let's say you did it by mistake. So now some are before sunset, before on the previous year, and the other ones are after sunset, which is on the next year. And so en torminu maserin mizeh al zeh. You cannot take from one batch for the other. The one from before sunset, that belongs to the previous fiscal year, and after sunset, even though it's only 2 minutes apart, belongs to the next year. You can't take maaser from the new crop, next year's crop, for last year's crop, and not the other way around either. Shenia maaser rishon, maaser sheni. Shelishit maaser rishon, maaser ani. And another effect of this law is if, let's say, it happened to be the end of the second year of the Shavuot cycle, and Tishrei is now starting the third year of the Shavuot cycle. So the maaser is different for each. We bring maaser rishon every year, except for Shavuot year. All 6 years, you always bring maaser rishon. That goes to the Levi. However, the first and second years of the Shemitah, we bring maaser sheni. Maaser sheni means I bring it, the farmer brings it to Jerusalem, and he has to eat it in Jerusalem. He can share it with anyone he wants, which he probably will, because you're bringing a tenth of your whole year's crop, and you only have to eat it just within a few days of your trip, probably just, for Sukkot. So you have to eat it in Jerusalem. That's the first, second, fourth, and fifth year. In the third and sixth year, you bring, besides maaser rishon to the Levi, also maaser ani. that you have to give to the poor. That's the 3rd and 6th year. So if you're at the end of the 2nd year, then whatever you picked right before sunset, you're going to have to take Maaser Rishon to the Levi, and Maaser Sheni you bring to Jerusalem. Whereas whatever you picked a minute after sunset, that is going to be Maaser Rishon, which is always, and you have to give that Maaser Ani. You cannot eat it in Jerusalem. So you see that this is the cutoff point. Good. Now, now we're going to go off into a bit of a tangent and wonder what is the source for the fact that in the 3rd year we bring Maaser Ani and not in other years. So this is good to know. After all, there is no Talmud Bavli on Zeraim. So we rely on these quotes within other Masechtot to know what the Talmud Bavli says about Mishnah in Zeraim. So Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, here's a pasuk: Ki techale la'aser, it's called ma'asar tibuatecha b'shana shirishit. Right, when you set aside in full the 10th part of your yield in the 3rd year. So what should you do with it? You give it to the Levi. The Levi here is not because it's Maaser Rishon. That's a separate thing. You're giving it to Levi because he's also poor, and to the stranger, and to the orphan and widow, because they're all usually poor. So you see here, it says the 3rd year, you give it to the poor. So that's how we know. Shana she'en ba ela maaser echad. And furthermore, we're learning from here that ma'asar tibuatecha. You see, the word ma'asar is singular, from which we learn that there is only one ma'aser in this year. So what is it? Hakesad ma'aser rishon, ma'aser ani, or ma'aser sheni yibatel. In other words, we know for sure in this year you have to give a 10th to the poor because it says so. Now, how do you know that this is not maybe an additional 10th? You have to give Maaser Rishon and Maaser Sheni and Maaser Ani. Maybe you have to give 30%. Sounds like a lot, but it would still be less than what we pay here. So, so therefore, the pasuk, because it says a single Maasad in only one, therefore we learn that this is Maaser Rishon, which we always give every year, and Maaser Ani only. Those two, Maaser Sheni, the one that you bring to Jerusalem, that does not apply in the 3rd year or in the 6th year. Okay, now we question that hypothesis. Wait a second, maybe because it's in singular in the pasuk in Devarim 26, maybe it means that you only bring Maaser Ani in the 3rd year and no other Maaser, not even Maaser Rishon, right? Because it's really singular. So therefore, Talmud Lomad ve'el halviyim tedaber v'amarta alehem ki tichum et bnei Yisrael et kol et hamaaser asher natati lachem etam benachalatchem. Pasuk in Devarim says, when you take from the Bnei Yisrael the tithes which I've given you as an inheritance. So this is important. It compares the Maaser Rishon to an inheritance, just like an inheritance. There's no interruption. If you get an inheritance, you get it anytime. So too, the Maaser has to be all the time, all 6 out of the 7 years, not Shemitah. And so from here we learn that Maaser Rishon is consistent always. And so therefore that pasuk in Devarim 26 was referring to when it says one Maaser, it means only one besides Maaser Rishon. So therefore Maaser Sheni is canceled. Maaser Ani takes effect the 3rd year and the 6th year. Good. So that was one version. We have now another Baraita that the second explanation of this Baraita is going to be the same as what we just said. The first is slightly different. Tanya idach ki techale la'aser. So when you finish making all your maaser, shana she'en ba ela maaser echad. So same thing, that this year has only one maaser. Hakesad, this is the same pasuk as we quoted before. So which one? If you're going to say only one maaser during the 3rd year, maaser rishon, maaser ani, or maaser sheni batel. So the one is maaser rishon, which is always plus 1. Maaser Ani, but not Maaser Sheni in the 3rd and 6th year. Maybe you think since it says only one Maaser in the 3rd year, then you don't even bring Maaser Rishon. Uba halevi. Kozman sheba ten lo divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So since the pasuk says, let me just bring it up. since the pasuk says that here, I'm just look at the context. This is talking about Maaser, and here it says that the Levi will come and ask for his due. So since it says Uba Levi, anytime he comes, you have to give it to him. So this is talking about Maaser Rishon, and therefore you have to give him the Maaser Rishon every year. So you have to give it to him. So that's one way of learning it. And here's the second way. To be Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer eno sarich. No, I don't need this derivation. This is too complicated, your derivation. I have a simpler one. So this is pasuk, same pasuk we had here from Bemidbar. Hikishu הכתוב לנחלה. מה הנחלה? אין לה הפסק, אף מעשה ראשון אין לו הפסק. Just like inheritance has no interruption, so to Maaser Rishon has no interruption. So that finishes this derivation, right? To summarize, Maaser Rishon, that goes to Levi, that's the main one that happens every year, all 6 years, without interruption, either because it's like compared to inheritance has no interruption, or because the pasuk says that you have to give it to him whenever he asks. So that's always. The question is the other one, because it talks about, come to Devarim, it says bring to Jerusalem a tenth. So fine, we know that that's gonna apply most years. But in Devarim it also says every 3 years. We learned the 3rd year and the 6th year. Every 3 years, give it to the poor. Oh, so well, what is that also in addition? But since it says singular, so that knocks out the Maaser Sheni. It does not knock out Maaser Rishon. Okay, good. So now we got that derivation. Now we go to the third item in that baraita that we quoted that started with the Yerakot, says Velindarim. So for vows. So Rosh Hashana, Tishrei is a new year for vows. Well, how would that apply? If someone says, I vow to have no benefit from you for 1 year. Well, then if it just says for a year, then you count from that date, from let's say it's Rosh Chodesh Av, and it'll be to the next Rosh Chodesh Av. So that's a full calendar year. But if he says, I will have no benefit from you, talking about they get angry at each other, they get into a fight, right? I'm not going to get anything from you, nothing to do with you for this year. He says, L'shana zo. Well, then that's talking about not a full 12-month year, but the official calendar year. Even if it's the last day of the year, it's the 29th of Elul. So nevertheless, the next day is Rosh Hashanah. That's it. That's 1 full year. So it's an easy way to say, I get nothing from you for a whole year, but you only have to do it for 1 day. This is like the bad joke that some people in the office always have to make every year on December, 31st. They say, see you next year, because it's only 1 day away. Good. We saw in a couple of dapim ago that there was 2 opinions about, is 1 day considered like a whole year? Rabbi Meir said yes. Rabbi Elazar said no. Only 30 days is the minimum time to be considered like a year. This is even according to the one who says you need 30 days to be considered like a year. 1 day is not enough. They would still agree to this law, because since the point of it is that he wants to accept upon himself to suffer, right? I'm going to suffer rather than be friends with you. So he suffered. That's the point. It doesn't matter really how long he suffered, even if he just does it a little bit. That is sufficient, and he fulfilled his vow. Okay, good. Now, Ve'ema Nisan. How do you know that if one makes a vow and he says this year, that he means from Tishrei to Tishrei? Maybe he means the other definition of a year, from Nisan to Nisan. How do we know what he means? Bindarim halech achal leshon bnei adam. This is a very important principle in vows, that when you want to interpret, sometimes language could be ambiguous. This is true for contract law also. Someone writes in a contract, some term, and it could have different meanings. So, I need to know legally, what does this term mean? So in the case of vows, we go by the usage of the majority of people. Right? Go ask people what they mean when they say something. So if you go around and ask people, what do you when you say a year, this year, what do you think it means? Most people will say, from Rosh Chodesh Tishrei till Tishrei. Even though, we know for other purposes, for months it's Nisan, but most people's usage is the year. Therefore, when they speak with the vow, that's what they mean. So that's why it's not really a derivation from the Torah. If time changed and people think of a year in a different way, then it will go by whatever the common usage is. All right, now a little bit more about Ma'aseh. This is a Mishnah in Ma'asrot. Tenanatam atiltan meshet tismach atevua v'azetim mishyavo shelish. Okay, we're talking about the cutoff times for different things that grow when they belong to one year or the other. So for vegetables, we're not talking about vegetables here, but vegetables are easy. The vegetables, as we saw, is when you pluck them, when you cut them from the ground. So if you cut them from the ground on a minute before sunset on Rosh Hashana, they belong to the previous year. And even though it's the same carrot, right, you just cut it 2 minutes later, it belongs to the next year. So the cutoff time is literally when you cut the vegetable, but not so for other items. For fenugreek, it's when it sprouts. In other words, if you have a fenugreek and it hasn't sprouted yet, and you cut it before sunset, then it'll be from the previous year. But if it has already sprouted, if you have a fenugreek and it goes into the next year and you cut it after sunset, let's say, right? But it already has sprouted beforehand, then it doesn't matter since it already sprouted. Whenever it sprouts, if it sprouted before sunset, it belongs to the previous year. If it sprouted after sunset, it belongs to the next year. It doesn't matter when you cut it. So that's the law for fenugreek. If you're wondering what fenugreek is, here's a picture of it. Okay, and for grain and olives, it's when they grow become a third ripe. So you go look at the grain. If it's a third ripe before sunset, then it'll go to the previous year. Even if you cut it after sunset, it doesn't matter. And if it's not a third ripe by the time sunset comes on Rosh Hashana, then it'll be for the next year. And the same thing, with when the year going out. Good. So regarding the fenugreek, what does it mean when it sprouts? When it sprouts for seeds, when it has seeds there that are available. Now let's see, where's the source? How do you know that for grain and olives, it's not when it's cut or when something else? How do you know that it's when it comes to a third? Here's the source. Amar Rab Aseh, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Umatu ba mishemed Rabbi Yosef HaGelili, Amar Chera, Meches Sheva Shanim, B'moed Shenat HaShemitah, B'chag HaSukkot. This is an unusual pasuk. It says at the end of 7 years, the end of the Shemitah, on Sukkot. Now, the end of the Shemitah year is at the end of Elul. Now, and Sukkot is already 15 days after. So, Shenat HaShemitah, Maya Bidete, B'chag HaSukkot, Sheminiti. So, what are you talking about when you say that it's the end of the Shemitah year, and that's Sukkot? That Sukkot is already into the 8th year. You're going way too far. You shouldn't call it Shenat HaShemitah. You should call it the Shana after Shemitah. The Shana, if it's talking about the Sukkot after the end of Shemitah. So why would you still call it the 7th year, even though it's actually after the 7th year? So it's to teach you that any grain that has already grown 1/3 during the Shvi'it, you have to treat it like Shvi'it grain even afterwards, right? As you go look on Rosh Hashanah, when at the end of Shvi'it, oh look, it's a third grown. Then that's it. You can't take it even a time later. Now, how do you know this? How do you derive it from the fact that Sukkot is here? Well, it seems that if you take certain fast-growing sprouts and you plant it on the last day of the year, it will already grow a third by the time that Sukkot comes around. So that's how we're deriving this 1/3 from this calendar. And that's the end of this stuff. And so we learned a lot about astronomy, and we also learned some important derivations about the fundamental laws of ma'asrot as regards to grain and vegetables and olives and grapes. Baruch Adonai L'olam. Amen ve'amen.